Before I introduce Gayani and a little bit about the session, let me just talk about a few housekeeping rules. Please have your cameras off while the discussion is happening, just to save bandwidth as well as less distractions. Keep your mute buttons or your microphones off. But there will be opportunity to ask questions as well as through the session. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box, and we'll definitely take those up as we go through the session. We have a built-in Q&A at the end, so the actual conversation DCLK and Gayani are going to have is limited to about 30 minutes so that you will have time to ask questions. As it clearly said, we are recording the session because we would like to share this on our YouTube channel so that we can share this with more people than people who have joined the session today. Also note, it's an informal discussion that we're having on this topic. And we're trying to help you understand and explore how respect in the workplace is linked to inclusion and how that creates the right kind of behavior. And let me now hand over to Gayani. Gayani is an attorney at law and an HR professional, and I think both her words kind of set her in the right place to explore this conversation and do the work that she's doing. So thank you, Gayani, so much for getting into this topic, which I think is really important. Let me now hand over to you. If you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and also what got you interested in this particular topic in Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Bani. My career has revolved around labor or employee-related matters. It has always interested me. Labor law was my favorite subject when I was studying law, and I also apprenticed and worked with a senior labor lawyer before I joined a global garments manufacturer in Sri Lanka. During my tenure in the garment industry, I was fortunate to get hands-on experience and exposure to streamlining payment of wages, handling harassment and abuse, employee misconduct, labor unrest, retrenchment, migrant labor, employee grievances, setting up numerous human resource policies and procedures, disability and access, and employee empowerment initiatives, etc. But the majority of my area of work was handling difficult or contentious topics, dealing with prickly situations where there has to be a good balance of what is right by the employee and what is right by the organization. And to be honest, that is my happy place. Improving conditions at work for employees, especially those employees who have less bargaining power due to their education and social circumstances, has been particularly interesting to me. I have worked in this space for over 13 years now, and in our part of the world, unfortunately, every job is not given dignity and respect it deserves. Some jobs are looked down upon and others venerated, and this has severely disadvantaged employee rights. So that is why I work in this space, dignity at work. For me, dignity at work means the right of a person to be valued and respected and to be treated ethically. So as a consultant, this is the space I work in. I work with several corporates, NGOs, and I also work as a consultant for the IFC as a trainer for Sri Lanka on respectful workplaces. Dignity at work has several components. It has compensation and benefits, empowerment, progression, inclusion, and in the treatment of employees. Today, we are going to discuss one such aspect of dignity at work, treating all employees with respect. I hope my little self-introduction helps you to understand the work I do.
Thank you so much, Gayani. As much as I'd love to dive into the questions, we're going to take 5 minutes or actually less and try and understand our audience a little bit around this subject, because what we're going to be talking about is a lot to do with what most of us have also experienced, and it kind of touches on stigma also in Sri Lanka. So I really appreciate if y'all can take about a minute, and there's a poll that will come on your screen with a couple of questions with some multiple choice answers. If you could just take 1 minute and answer as accurately and as honestly as possible. It's anonymous, so all we'll be able to see is the total numbers and percentages. If all of us can answer this. I hope everybody can see it. If there's any questions, just let us know. The first question, which of these statements are accurate for you? There are a couple of options there to tick one or more. Where did this situation you refer to occur? We're also asking the question about the harassment and who, in your opinion, initiated this harassment. What external action in the situation that you were in at that particular point, what would you have liked to have seen as a support mechanism? Those are the questions. Natalie, do you see people clicking on it? Nats, when you see the numbers going up, you can...
We have 55% voted at the moment, so we'll just give another 20 seconds and I'm sure we'll get percentage. So we have a 62% vote. So maybe, oh, it's increasing. Okay, we're up to 75%.
Since it's just an indication that we're trying to get, and I don't want to delay the conversation, why don't we look at the results? Okay, Gayani, can you also see the poll?
I can.
Okay. Let me just try to see what I'm seeing here. First question, which of these statements are accurate for you? The largest number, which is 75%, said, I have witnessed others who have been harassed. Then you have a 25 and a 20% that says, I have been personally harassed in the past, and I have not seen any harassment also. So the majority is saying that they have witnessed harassment. Where did the situation you refer to occur? 65% is saying it's in a public setting. 55% is saying at work. 15% not applicable, and 5% talk about at home. Was this harassment initiated by? The majority is saying by a more senior person. Then we also have a close 45% saying by an equal or peer. We have 30% not applicable, and there is a small percentage saying even by a junior person. And so the final question with regards to potential solutions, what external action would have made you feel safer? We have 65% saying clear information on whom to report the incident to, authorities, higher management, etc. Then we have 45% saying someone who to have intervened to support you at the time of the incident. 40% say someone who you can talk to confidentially about the incident. What do these results, Gayani, kind of tell you with all the other results that you have shared in the past, results in your research?
I was kind of thinking, Bani, that there are some questions that I will be addressing later on, and I feel these numbers are very reflective of that. And I feel that I will take it on as and when that particular discussion we're having, because then I think it will make more sense to people, and also feel that the numbers really do match up with the statistics that we have.
Okay, great. So let's get into the conversation. Okay, so how we're going to do this, guys, is DCLK has some planned questions, which we will start off with. And as we go through the questions, if there are any other questions that you have that we are not capturing here, feel free to type them in so that we can actually make it flow through as a conversation, and we'll take it up through the conversation or at the end where we think it's appropriate. Let's start off, Gayani, on the C-190 Violence and Harassment Convention that Sri Lanka is studying towards ratification. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and what that actually means?
Right, so C-190 focus on the elimination of violence and harassment in the world of work. And it was brought in by the ILO in June 2019. So far, there has been no international treaty prior to this that dealt with violence and harassment in the world of work. And it also brings in some uniform terminology. When we discuss terminology later on in our discussion, I will point out new focus areas that will have an impact on corporates, who is our audience here today. I will try my best to give as much detail in a concise manner so that you understand what C-190 is bringing in and what are the changes that we as corporates need to kind of adapt to. So the convention acknowledges that violence and harassment in the world of work affects a person's psychology. It affects a person's physical and sexual health. It affects a person's dignity. It affects his or her family and the social environment. It also says that violence and harassment affects the quality of public and private services. And it recognizes that there are vulnerable groups, especially girls and women, from accessing, remaining, and advancing in the labor market. So the convention highlights many more impacts of violence and harassment has on the world of work, but I feel these three are adequate as an introductory session to C-190. A good place to start discussing this convention would be the coverage it offers. It talks about a world of work. So what does this mean, right? This convention applies to all sectors, be it private, public, formal, informal, urban, rural. It covers it all, right? I'll break this down to you when we talk what we mean by private, public, and so forth, right? So it protects workers as defined by national law and practice. This is an aspect that we are all very familiar with. But then it goes on to protect persons working irrespective of their contractual status. So we are used to, as corporates, our harassment and abuse policies covering our employees, maybe the people that work with us, like third-party service providers, and maybe interns, trainees, things like that. But this convention goes a little extra. It covers interns, it does cover trainees, apprentices, volunteers, but now it stretches a little bit more. It covers job seekers and job applicants too. So it's more broader than what we are used to. Coverage is also offered to the informal sector workers, considering that in Sri Lanka, majority earn their livelihoods outside of the formal sector. This is a much needed step. So self-employed persons, street vendors, persons attached to the gig economy, all would be protected. Another thing is many corporates engage with casual employment, sourcing daily workers either directly or through manpower agencies, or outsourcing or subcontracting arrangements. All of this will fall within the scope of this convention. And I think this, everybody would be very happy to know, it covers domestic workers as well, because C190 applies to the private space. In Sri Lanka, as you all know, domestic workers have been excluded from almost all labor and employment legislation. So this really is a welcome step forward for them. It also applies to migrant workers. So now you can see the coverage is pretty wide. The convention then goes on to expand the scope of protection beyond the traditional workplace. It states that violence and harassment occurring in the course of, linked with, or arising out of work, and sets out certain work locations. Some work locations we are very familiar with, right? The general place where employees work, right? Washing facilities, canteen facilities, places where they take a rest or break. But now it extends a little bit more. During work-related trips, travel, training, events, or even social activities are covered through work-related communications. And this includes information and communication technology methods, all the methods that we use. It also talks about eliminating violence and harassment in employer-provided accommodation. So some of this sounds very familiar, and we are all nodding our heads thinking, yes, yes, so far even we do this, right? But maybe not this last one. It also covers when commuting to and from work. And I'm not just talking about company provided transport, but even public transport as well. So as per C190, the responsibility to prevent and eliminate violence and harassment in the world of work that we kind of spoke about now has been assigned to the government, to the employers, to the workers, and also to their respective organizations. So the convention has to be read together with the recommendations R206, as the recommendation sets out some practical steps on the measures necessary to successfully adopt the convention. I'll give you an example. Now, generally, when we talk about violence and harassment in the world of work, we always think that it's affecting labor or employment law. But as violence and harassment is known to have a psychological effect, it now moves over to occupational health and safety and the need to take it into account and the associated psychological risks, and we need to manage that in our occupational safety and health. So you have to identify hazards, assess the risks of violence and harassment, and with the participation of workers and their representatives, take measures to prevent and control them. So that is just one example of what the recommendations talk about. All the recommendations that are set out in R206 calls for an integrated approach where the employer adopts and implements a policy on violence and harassment, but it has to be in consultation with the workers. Currently, the practice, most corporates has its management, it's very management driven process, right? In a nutshell, this is what C190 and R206 brings to the table. Whether Sri Lanka ratifies this convention or not, which we are to see in the future, if there are corporates who are interested in being more inclusive in the space of violence and harassment at work, this convention offers a lot of progressive guidance on this topic.
Thank you. So that was a little bit of a legal spiel you gave. Thank you for breaking it down also for us, Gayani. What I'd like to now go into is trying to break it down a little bit and trying for us to figure out as individuals, as companies, as to what this means and how we can actually be a part of creating this respect in the workplace. If I may start with a few of the terminology that we tend to hear from maybe less legal and more from a workplace. You know, I've been in human resources for the past 20 years. When we talk about harassment, can you kind of break down what harassment means? Then there's sexual harassment, and then there's bullying. If you can maybe break that down for us to know what the difference is.
Sure. So violence and harassment actually consists of behavior and practices. It's a range of unacceptable behavior and practices. It can be single occurrence or repetitive. So these unacceptable behavior and practices, which can be a single occurrence or repetitive, it has an aim, or it results in, or likely to result in a physical, psychological, sexual, or economic harm. So as you can see, this is the uniform terminology that is coming in with C190, and this definition is very broad, and it includes gender-based violence and harassment. Right? You might think gender-based violence and harassment means sexual harassment. And yes, but it also includes other forms of violence that is directed towards a particular gender, like domestic violence. So this convention makes provision for the government and the employer to take appropriate measures to mitigate the impacts of domestic violence even in the world of work. And it includes leave for victims of domestic violence as well. Right? So you can now begin to see how the definition of violence and harassment has become extremely broad. So it's in this big umbrella term of violence and harassment that you would have other types of harassment that we see at the workplace, right? And we also see certain things happening in our family or in our private spaces also having an impact in our workspace. So when you take violence and harassment, as I said, it's unacceptable behavior and practices. So if you just understand it in that little nutshell, unacceptable behavior and practices, these unacceptable behavior and practices can be broken into 4 areas: physical, verbal, psychological, and sexual. I'm sure most of you all would have heard of these 4, right? So the physical is pushing someone, slapping someone, right, assaulting someone. So these are some of the examples. Verbal is the use of demeaning words, insulting, name calling, screaming, threatening. All of this are examples of verbal unacceptable behavior. Psychological has 2 components. It can be words and it can also be actions. So these words and actions that diminish or attempt to diminish a but an action, an example for an action would be ignoring someone, right? When that person is speaking to you, you completely ignore that person and you turn around, right? So this is like a psychological action of where you are attempting to diminish a person's self-worth, right? The 4th one is sexual. I'm sure you all are very much aware of this. It's unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, which makes a person feel offended, humiliated, and even intimidated. So that is the basic definition of violence and harassment. So this is a big umbrella term, and under this big umbrella term, you would get other definitions as well. So Bani, would it be okay if I move on to sexual harassment and workplace bullying?
Sure. So I think the one point I want to make is harassment is a lot larger. Sexual is just one component of it. And
Correct.
All of these harassments are all unproductive and counterintuitive when it comes to creating inclusion. So why I wanted that difference is we are all sort of familiar with sexual harassment as a term when we are in the workplace, but also to make everybody realize just the harassment component is just as important and something that we need to protect in our workplace as well. Sure, if you could maybe dive into the whole workplace bullying.
Right. So workplace bullying, I will break down the sexual harassment definition as well, but I'll start off with workplace bullying because this is something that we tend to overlook. Bullying is repeated and it occurs over time, and it can be directed against a person or towards a group of persons as well. So it's behavior that is repeated, occurs over a time, and the behavior is offensive, it's cruel, it's vindictive, and you try to humiliate that person or that group of persons, right? So I'll give you some examples. Unjustified and constant negative remarks or criticisms would tantamount to bullying, right? Scolding in front of others like customers or their peers, right? Refusing to grant leave for emergency, excluding a person from social contacts and or gossiping about it would be an easy way for you to understand what is meant by bullying. When it comes to sexual harassment, as I said, it's unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature. So how do you ascertain whether it is unwelcome? What constitutes sexual harassment depends on how it is perceived by the recipient. The intention of the alleged perpetrator is not relevant. What others who witness this think or perceive about the incident is also not relevant. So what is relevant is how is it perceived by the recipient and whether the action is unwelcome. That is key to understanding whether sexual harassment has taken place. Barney, can I leave it at that in the interest of time?
Oh, yeah. So I guess what I'm understanding from how you broke it down is the bullying component is very much linked with harassment, and it could be, and why I'm bringing up bullying is in our cultures, even in our school systems, there tends to be a little bit of bullying which is considered ragging, which is considered almost normal, versus in, what you just spoke about in the C190, as well as when you're talking about the definitions, all of those are actually, breaking the rules of creating an inclusive workplace. Am I right in saying that?
That's right, yes.
Okay. I just want to take a second to try and connect the two with regards to diversity, inclusion, and respect and dignity. Feeling respected, feeling like you belong, you being treated with dignity is the foundation for what inclusion is. So creating that safety for your employees or safety for whomever you are, whatever community we're referring to in this particular point. And I keep saying community because as much as workplace is one of the areas we're talking about it, this transcends to me even into any sort of community or a space that more than one person or a group of people are interacting in. Can we talk a little bit about the stigma we have and we continue to hear in Sri Lanka? This to me is really important, along with if the C190 convention is ratified, that is Sri Lanka being very progressive towards actually wanting to see change, much needed change. Tell us a little bit about the stigma and where that stems from, please.
Right. So in terms of Sri Lanka, there is a sense of stigma around sexual harassment. So the stigma actually stems from experiencing a bad response after reporting. So where does this bad response come from? It can come from the workplace and it can come from the community at large. In terms of the workplace, being discriminated, retaliations against you for having complained, or being threatened, losing your job, or causing someone to lose their job, being the subject of gossip are examples of experiencing a bad response from the workplace. A bad response can also come from the community at large. especially when you're pursuing through the legal process, because as you all know, sexual harassment in Sri Lanka is a criminal offense, right? So there's a way in which if you are going to pursue the legal process, you need to go to the police station, make a complaint, and then the police investigates, and there's a criminal proceeding that will be held. So during this process, there have been lots of reported cases of complainants being victimized. Apart from that, there is negative media attention. Negative media attention not only on you personally, where people, go through your Facebook, your Instagram, and pull out pictures of you, right? But they also have a negative media attention on your family. And this can also lead to not being able to find employment and having a black mark on your character. So if you look at all of these bad responses that can come, be it from the workplace or from the community, this stigma becomes more severe if you come from a place of less power and privilege. For example, if you're a female complainant, all of the factors I mentioned earlier becomes even more overbearing due to the harmful social norms that we have imposed on how a female should behave. So the community at large, and even sometimes your work colleagues, begins to judge you. Like, what was she wearing? Was she having a drink? Why did she go to that party? Like, all these questions come up about your character. And all of this becomes part of the process, and it proves to be an extreme deterrent that prevent employees from complaining, prevent people from coming forward even as witnesses, and even preventing supervisors from taking action. So that really is the stigma around sexual harassment and reporting it. So that is why you would see many people in Sri Lanka being very reluctant to report sexual harassment at the workplace.
Have you seen better ways of dealing with this whole situation in other types of companies where it is a lot more supportive, other than maybe what you just described? I mean, you just described what in general it could be. Is there a better way to do it, and have you seen that in Sri Lanka that might be helpful to all of us?
Yes, actually, there have been some, I must say that I have noticed this in the NGO sector, and I have not seen this much in the corporate sector. This is where they have built an ecosystem, right? I think the primary understanding is that like when we come to work, right, we have to understand that every individual who is employed has different social, economic, educational backgrounds, and whether we are ready to accept it or not, they bring their learned behavior, their perceptions, their attitude, and their biases to work, and they bring them to work every day. So how do you alter an employee's attitude and perception regarding violence and harassment? Firstly, you have to understand that it takes time, right? So, and it's considering that it takes time, that the NGO sector has built an ecosystem. And I'll kind of break these pieces down, right? Of course, when you're building an ecosystem, you have to understand operational realities specific to your organization. You may have a high LTO, the education levels of your employees, right? But their ecosystem has several components. One is the reporting mechanisms. They have several reporting mechanisms, right? And the reporting mechanisms are very flexible. You don't have to stick to one method of it. You can always skip levels, right? And I'm sure most corporates also have open door policy skip levels, but as to whether that is actually practiced and encouraged is another question altogether. And the second component of that ecosystem is a robust investigation procedure, which is first and foremost empathetic. Secondly, it is confidential. and it has a both formal and informal method of investigations. Now, in most corporates, we have formal investigation process, right? But we really need to look at this informal one. It was very enlightening for me, really, to see this informal method. And they even have very simple things like uh, asking the persons to stop that behavior. It's as simple as that. And they have even small protocols on how do you ask a person to stop. So those are very important formal investigation kind of methods that they have. And the other is training and awareness. Not only what is meant by harassment and equipping, but equipping people with tools which such as effective communication, how to handle subordinates, because sometimes we promote people or individuals due to their individual performance, but we don't stop to understand whether such person has the necessary tools to lead a team. For example, micromanaging can lead into bullying. So having training and awareness, not only on what is meant by harassment, but they have this continuous training and awareness for people, which is consistent and continuous, not one-off. They also provide support mechanisms like counseling and support to alter unacceptable behavior. Now that too is a very important thing that we can really adopt. And of course, lastly, a monitoring and evaluation, so which would enable employers to check and adjust their procedures and practices, right? So that's the kind of ecosystem that is there in the NGO sector. And I have seen some really fantastic ways of dealing with harassment and nipping it in the bud. So without allowing it to escalate or for it to reoccur. So that is something really useful that corporates can learn from.
Okay. So I think what caught my attention, I know you gave many options there, but that whole thing about having different ways in how a person can actually make the complaint or have the conversation around it, I think is important, because the empathy, I think, is what you refer to is also realizing there is a certain level of trauma this person is going through, and it's not just a SOP or a process. We do need to think of this person and the fact that there is a little bit of preventative and support. I'm going to say support for both parties, so that the party who is doing the wrong thing is not just the perpetrator or the bad person, but also giving them a support to try and change their behavior, so that you end up with a win-win instead of a win and a lose situation. And that all kind of leads to being inclusive. Without making judgment, you're actually trying to help make the situation better overall. Thank you for that. And I think those are things that we can ponder on to actually try and figure out how some of these better practices that you seem to have seen as corporates can also adopt if we don't actually practice some of these things that you mean. If I may ask, I know sometimes statistics are pretty low in Sri Lanka. Do we have any stats on sexual harassment, either in the workplace or sexual harassment in general?
In 2017, there was a study done by the UNFPA, that's United Nations Population Fund, and it revealed that 90% of women and girls in Sri Lanka have been subjected to sexual harassment on public transport. And I think that was also clear in our poll that we took as well, right,
Yes.
Bani?
Yes.
And this study was important for another factor, because it also found out that 37% of affected women said that their experience in the public transport had negatively affected their work performance, right? So this is the only piece of research that currently supports the business case for investing in safe work environments in Sri Lanka. Apart from this study, there is very little information on the occurrence or prevalence of harassment and violence at work in the world of work in Sri Lanka. Not just sexual harassment, but all types of harassment at work. But of course, I'm sure most of you are very familiar with in terms of key guidelines that were set out. In 2013, the EFC and the ILO had a specific guideline on addressing sexual harassment. And I think Arosha Adhikaram in 2020 also published a journal article on handling sexual harassment complaints in Sri Lanka. But it has always had that focus on sexual harassment. But I do believe that there is an organization that is looking to collect data on violence and harassment. So the bigger picture, not just sexual harassment in the world of work, but I will not name the organization as it has to be officially communicated by them. But I think if you're a corporate and you want to figure out your own stats, I think doing a survey, a quick pulse check on with a narrow focus like violence and harassment at the workplace can help you. So that's a good place to start if you are interested to address. So yeah, Bani.
In the research that you've been doing, are there any global stats or any sort of numbers that we can extrapolate just to see how big this problem is in general?
Well, there is a study done in Myanmar, and that too highlighted the same percentage, about like 40% having experienced workplace harassment and abuse. So, I mean, there are lots of stats that are available in terms of a global perspective. But what I really feel is that it's important first and foremost to figure out the Sri Lankan context as well. Because as you've said, Bani, there are certain cultural aspects in Sri Lanka, and in some of the studies that we've done, it's highlighted that there is a general acceptance of some form of bullying, like they consider that as camaraderie. And when does that camaraderie stop and when does it become bullying? So those cultural dynamics change from country to country. So yes, there are studies, but I'm looking forward to this study which will be done in Sri Lanka.
Okay, thank you. Let me now steer the conversation into the peers or the I don't know whether it's the right term, but the spectators or the rest of the population in when some of these situations happen. Now, like the poll said, a lot of these things happen in public. You know, not, I'm sure that lots happen behind closed doors, but it sounds like if you take our sample group, and I think from everything I've spoken to you about, a lot of this happens in public. And so if it is happening in public, there is the person who's being victimized, and there's the person, the perpetrator, who's doing the bullying or the harassment. Can we talk a little bit about the role all of us play who have observed this happening? What is the role we are playing, and what is the role we can play to actually change this narrative? Do we have a role to play?
Okay, so I think the poll said that 75% of us have witnessed something, right? So what's this role or what's the positive change that we can really do? So there were 75% of us who witnessed something. And I want to explain this with an example. In the workplace, as you said, Bani, most of the time, the first occurrence of violence and harassment takes place in a public setting where there are other people around, and they're looking on. The most important person or the persons are these people who are looking on. We can call them bystanders, right? That person or persons have the ability to intervene. This is the person who can really create a positive change. When an incident takes place, this person who is looking on or the bystander has the opportunity to play 4 roles. Play the classic role of I saw and heard nothing. You can be a spectator, you can be an observer, or you can be a witness. What we want to do as a first step is to convert people to become observers. We don't want employees pretending they saw or heard nothing. We don't want employees to be a spectator who enjoys and encourages harassment and bullying to take place, like as if you're watching a game, like a cricket match, a spectator at a cricket match, right? What we want is for employees to be an observer. That is the first key step. To do that, we must encourage employees to ask two questions from themselves, right? Would you feel comfortable if that incident happened to you? Second, would you feel comfortable if that incident happened to your loved one? These two questions are going to help you to understand your next steps. What we want is people to intervene. How should employees intervene is another aspect that we need to address, right? Give them clear guidelines and training on it. And it depends on circumstances of each case. The intervention protocols can be formed. You can have protocols for during when an incident is happening just then or after the incident has taken place. So for an example, during the incident, you can have behavior guidelines for people who are looking on or bystanders. You intervene, but not in an aggressive or hostile intervention, right? You move the conversation along to take the negative attention away from the victim, right? You diffuse situation. So those are some examples during the incident. What can an onlooker do? What can a bystander do, right? An example of what kind of intervention can you do after the incident has happened is, if it's possible, and I think here 45% said that you have observed a peer doing it. That means you really can have a discussion with that alleged perpetrator. That is possible. Then 60% said that it was a senior person. If that is the case, then maybe you need to report it to someone who can speak on behalf of you or who will support you to speak with that alleged perpetrator. So the key lesson is in the first occurrence itself. Persons who are looking on or bystanders needs to intervene in a positive way to prevent that behavior from escalating and reoccurring. What we are doing is indicating to persons that these behaviors are not tolerated at our workplace. That is just one example of the pivotal role of a peer who is really looking on. And I think that is something that we can all start doing. And you also asked me the question of who is responsible for calling out behavior. So it's a very interesting question, and I like to answer it by stating that at work, whether we like it or not, whether we admit it or not, we play 4 roles when it comes to harassment and bullying. We can be the complainant. I think that is easy to relate to. Okay, we can be a person looking on. Again, easy to relate to. We can be the supervisor. Again, easy to relate to. But also know that you can be the perpetrator too. Many people don't like to admit this. But if we look closely, there may be room for improvement in the way we deal with our colleagues, our subordinates, and supervisors. So, who is ultimately responsible for calling out unacceptable behavior? It is all of us. We're all responsible, as we all have the capacity to play the 4 roles that I mentioned.
So I think you bring up a really good point. Even if we're talking about in a company, in rolling something like this out, it is not merely talking about the action somebody who has been victimized can take. It is not just the responsibility of the manager when complaints come to them, but more important, and where you can actually make a change in a culture, is if everybody in the company is aware that they have a role to play, and they almost become the guardian to having this inclusive culture of no harassment in the workplace. Something comes to mind, came to mind when you were talking about it. The only thing necessary for triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. This was said by Edmund Burke, but I think even Martin Luther King mentioned it. And this, I think, is so relevant here from what you've been saying, because at the end of the day, it's so easy for us to focus on the victim and the perpetrator, versus we are all there with so much power to actually make some change. And are we actually doing that? I guess that's the question I'd like to leave with the audience. And anyone else who's watching, or when you carry on this conversation further on. There are a couple of questions, Gayani, that I'd like to try and see whether I can answer before I go into my final questions. Let me see. Has Sri Lanka ratified this convention? If yes, what are the structures in place? I think you mentioned that they're not ratified, right? Yeah.
No, the answer is no. Sri Lanka is still studying it.
Then there is a longer question. So this is a huge issue that adversely affects more than 50% of the population on a daily basis. Do we have a national plan to change this situation? If not, why not? What have the private sector and Chamber of Commerce done about it? A national plan can be drafted within a couple of months. Do you have any visibility into this kind of work? Are you involved in any of this kind of work?
So if the convention is ratified, there has been a lot of people working in this space, especially trying to understand the existing laws in Sri Lanka and what are the gaps. Because as I told you, this convention talks about sectors that we have never dealt with in terms of workplace harassment and abuse. Actually, we haven't even considered them as work. For example, street vendors, right? They have, or even domestic workers, they hardly have any employment rights. So there's a if anyone's interested, there's a very interesting article. Actually, it's a study done by Shamali Ranaraja. She has done it on behalf of the National Union of Seafarers, Sri Lanka. And she has done a wonderful gap analysis of the Sri Lankan law and what would it mean for Sri Lanka to ratify and what are the gaps. So that is one good place to start. The other is that it's really working together with a lot of ministries, the Ministry of Transport, Women and Children's, and also the Labour Department as well. So there is a lot of work that is being carried out in terms of studying if we are to adopt, what are the changes necessary. People also spoke about what is the private sector doing. The private sector has done a lot in their own speed to their own companies. I think that is important to understand. And there are lots of leading players as well in this space, right? They do annual surveys, they try to tackle harassment and abuse. And I also know companies that terminate services of employees if they feel their misconduct was of that serious nature. So the private sector does do some work in this as well. So I think it's a combination effort, and in Sri Lanka, it's going to take a little while for everybody to come on board because, as you know, rather than the large corporates in Sri Lanka, you take the smaller SME sector in Sri Lanka and you talk about respect at work. It's an unheard of concept. It's really not in our culture at work. Right? The bigger companies, yes, they have a policy, they have something going on. It may not be 100% perfect, but there's something going on, but nothing at all in the SME sector. So I think that really shows you the battle we have. It's not just about a national policy, it's also about changing people's mindsets. And I think we have to start younger, maybe even from the education system itself, where these kind of values need to be taught to children, and then they embody that and they bring that to the workplace. But we don't have that currently.
Thank you, Gayani. And I realize this is a huge mountain that we're trying to climb. Totally appreciate the effort you're putting towards this, a dedicated effort that you're putting towards this. But I think that the whole point of us having this conversation and actually bringing all of you all together to talk about this is to make it clear that all of us do have a part to play in trying to make this change. I mean, it's very easy for all of us to complain about Sri Lanka, and I think we're all guilty of that. But the reality is, the reasons we're having these sessions, the reason we're going to put Gayani's contact details also at back up on the end, is to be able to, if you feel strongly about this, find out what you can do in your company, what you can do with some of the national effort work that she's working on, and you know, even Diversity Collective Lanka, what we can do. And again, I'm going to say, you know, I'm all about these social causes, wanting to do things, but again, I'm one person. I will be pushed to do more of this. We will all be pushed to do more of it if there are more people talking against it and talking about it. So that is, I think, something all of us can do individually, in terms of now that we better understand how to tackle this conversation. And I think that is the value of us having this conversation, and also giving you all an opportunity to listen and understand, because I think that it's not just government or just one company leader or one company that can actually make change. Is a lot of awareness and education. So Gayani, thank you so much for breaking this down for us. If I may ask just one final question, I think we're almost out of time also. In a company as a leader, and when I say leader, I'm not saying you have to be CEO of a company. When you're in a position of leadership where you have a team, you can influence. What are some of the things each of us can try to do if we're trying to change it in more than just maybe a household or just a small space? Are there any tips to get us rolling on some of these activities?
I think the effectiveness of addressing violence and harassment rests largely on leadership. I think leadership kind of needs to understand that you can also be part of the problem, right? To be open to feedback from your team regarding your behavior, have informal 360 feedback on your behavior and the practices that you have, right? But at the same time, know that you are an integral part of the solution. And with that in mind, when incidents are brought to your attention, ask two questions from yourself. Can I be fair and unbiased to the complainant and the alleged perpetrator? What I mean by this question is, do you have a close relationship with either party, the complainant or the alleged perpetrator? Or is the complainant or the alleged perpetrator one of your best performers, right? Secondly, you ask, am I capable of handling this in a sensitive manner? For these two questions, if your answer is no, I can't be fair and unbiased because he's my best performer, he or she, I don't want to lose them, or no, I'm not capable of handling this in a sensitive manner, then step away and hand it over to a person who is capable of handling this. And I think the third thing that a leader can do is lead by example, right? So go for those little training sessions, awareness sessions on what is harassment, what is bullying, right? And understand that it is a journey. It is going to take us some time and to be consistent at it. So yes, Bani, that would be my final words, I think.
Thank you. We have a suggestion saying perhaps a recording of today's webinar could be sent to major companies and policymakers as much as possible. I think that's a great idea, and glad we did the recording, and we will try and see how we can actually make it a campaign and try to send it around. Also realize Gayani is working on this in this space with a lot of larger policy making or policy influencing bodies. So if there are things that you want to do in your company, and you feel like she can give you some support, some consultancy, and indications on how to actually move this forward, you know, please feel free to reach out. Her contact details are on the screen, and this is one of the reasons that we actually brought this up, because we want the conversation to carry on, and we see Gayani as a resource person who can actually help. I did say final question, but I just thought of one other thing. Are there any sort of indicators in companies that leaders can actually try to use to measure? And have you seen measurements that are helpful, harmful, that we kind of all trapped to right now?
I'm going to equate and bring in theory that is generally used in health and safety. And I think most of you might be familiar with this, right? But I think that approach is useful to give us focus on how to prevent. Most of us have heard of the correlation between near misses and accidents. We consider accident to be a lagging indicator. What does it mean? It looks backwards, right? Like through a rear view mirror and tells you what has happened. Monitoring a lagging indicator doesn't enable you to prevent. So a lagging indicator, like the number of accidents alone, is not a good measure. In terms of violence and harassment at the workplace, having an indicator to the number of reported sexual harassment cases, number of reported bullying, number of reported discrimination cases is similar to monitoring accidents. You are monitoring after it has happened. But let's look at the other indicator, that is near misses, right? I'm just taking an example from health and safety. Near misses are considered as a leading indicator for health and safety. Those that are not familiar with the near miss, that is where under different circumstances, it could have resulted in harm. We say, like in Sinhalese, we say, anu namin beruna, kind of, those kind of situations, right? So this is an indicator that helps to prevent. These kind of indicators or this approach is what is required for organizations to monitor respect at work. In terms of violence and harassment, an example would be the number of bystanders or onlookers intervening for bullying can be a leading indicator. Because as you know, bullying is repetitive and it occurs over time. So if there are ways we can monitor the number of times people are intervening to stop that kind of behavior, then we are actually preventing it from reoccurring. So that's just some ideas that people are kind of working with to make it more preventable as opposed to measuring after an incident has happened.
Thank you so much, Gayani. I know we're over time, but if you don't mind, I will just open the floor out if there to anyone, if there are any other questions. I think I've kind of captured everything that has been put in the chat box. I'll leave it open for about a minute, just in case anybody wants to unmute and talk to Gayani, ask any questions, any comments. Any sort of feedback is appreciated as we do more and more webinars. We're hoping to try and capture important conversations towards many things, not just limited to sexual harassment, but topics that we think are relevant towards changing the landscape, especially in the area of diversity and inclusion. Any questions, any more questions, if anybody has? Okay, thank you so much, Gayani, for your time. I found it really interesting, and thank you so much for answering all the questions I had lined up. As we told everybody, we have the recording. The recording will be on YouTube that we will put up as soon as we get the recording ready for sharing. And if you have any questions with regards to this, if you have any interest in joining DCLK to support with some of these initiatives and actions that we're working on, the original poster had a spot where you could actually join Diversity Collective Lanka also. So thank you again, Gayani. And hopefully we'll see you soon with regards to some of the actions that we also want to support in when it comes to creating respect in the workplace and what Diversity Collective Lanka can do with you as we progress on this journey.
Thank you, Bani and DCLK, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share my knowledge. Thank you.